There was a time when entire neighborhoods in California lived in fear. Couples slept with baseball bats under their beds. Dogs barked at the slightest creak in the night. Porch lights flickered on and off, neighbors whispering warnings over fences. A predator was loose, and no one knew who he was or where he'd strike next. He wore a ski mask. He carried a gun. He stalked his victims before ever entering their homes. He moved silently, methodically, with an unsettling familiarity. Sometimes he would break in and leave, only to return later. He tied up husbands and raped wives. Then he escalated. Robbery became rape. Rape became murder. And then he vanished. For decades, the case went cold. Multiple police departments had different names for him. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, but the face behind the mask remained a phantom until science caught up. In 2018, after more than 40 years of silence, the Golden State Killer finally had a name. He wasn't caught in the act. He wasn't turned in by an accomplice. He was betrayed by his own DNA, scattered across decades-old crime scenes, and unwittingly preserved by genealogy websites. This is the story of how one of the most elusive serial predators in American history was unmasked, not by bullets, badges, or stakeouts, but by a revolution in science and a drop of blood no one thought would speak again. In the 1970s, California was a land of contrasts. The state shimmered with sunlit suburbs, booming industries, and a spirit of progress. But beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Crime rates across the country were rising, and California was no exception. The optimism of the post-war years gave way to unease. Locking your door was no longer just a precaution. It became a nightly ritual. In Sacramento County, the fear took on a sharper edge. In 1976, a series of home invasions began to ripple through the area. The intruder was precise. He targeted middle-class homes in quiet neighborhoods. He often struck at night, slipping in through sliding glass doors or unlocked windows. Sometimes he left strange items behind, rearranged furniture, or left rope for his victims to find, clear signs he'd been there before. Then came the rapes. Dozens of women, often attacked while their husbands or boyfriends were restrained nearby. Law enforcement noticed a disturbing pattern. He would tie up the man, place dishes on his back, and tell him if he heard a sound, he'd kill them both. He would then assault the woman, sometimes for hours. These weren't crimes of opportunity. They were planned. Victims reported seeing unfamiliar cars in their neighborhoods. Break-ins occurred days before the actual attacks. Phone calls would precede or follow the assaults. The man seemed to study his victims, learn their routines, and pick the perfect time. Fear spread. Communities installed floodlights and motion detectors. Neighborhood watch groups formed. But nothing stopped him. As the attacks moved down the state, Stockton Modesto Davis, he remained one step ahead. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Just trauma, silence, and a sickening sense that he could be watching again. At the time, no one knew these crimes were just the beginning. The Golden State Killer did not hunt at random. His victims were chosen. His attacks were ritualized, deliberate, and eerily consistent. What began as a string of burglaries evolved into one of the most disturbing patterns of violence in American criminal history. His victims spanned ages and demographics, but many shared common traits. Most lived in single-story suburban homes near parks, bike paths, or canals, places where someone could watch without being seen. Many of the women were young, in relationships, or mothers. They often received hang-up calls in the days or weeks leading up to the crime. Sometimes their homes had been broken into before. Police later discovered evidence of prowling, footprints, and even stolen items returned. Once inside, he moved with chilling control. He used shoelaces, cord, or ligatures he brought himself. He gagged his victims, blindfolded them, and often whispered threats. He'd rummage through their belongings, eat food from their kitchen, or leave strange tokens behind. In some cases, he stayed for hours, moving freely while his victims lay helpless and terrified. He was patient, If a couple lived together, he would subdue the man first, tying him up, sometimes stacking dishes on his back, and warning him that if he heard them rattle, both would die. Then he would assault the woman, often multiple times, and disappear as silently as he came. By the end of 1979, the attacker had struck over 50 times. Then the pattern shifted again. The man who once left his victims alive began killing them. The murders started in Southern California. Young couples were found bound and bludgeoned. Sometimes the woman was raped, sometimes not. In other cases, entire families were wiped out. There were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, just the same eerie precision and the same vanishing act. In the absence of a name, people began calling him what they feared most. In the North, he was the East Area Rapist. In the South, the original Night Stalker. Few realized they were chasing the same phantom. But the victims remembered, and their stories would become the foundation of a puzzle no one could solve. Until DNA changed everything. For decades, law enforcement believed they were tracking multiple predators. In Northern California, they searched for the East Area Rapist, a masked man responsible for more than 50 sexual assaults between 1976 and 1979. In Southern California, investigators hunted the original Night Stalker, a serial killer who struck from 1979 to 1986, leaving a trail of murdered couples behind. Earlier still, between 1974 and 1975, residents of Visalia had been haunted by an elusive burglar dubbed the Visalia Ransacker. He broke into over 100 homes, often vandalizing rather than stealing, leaving behind unsettling signs of intrusion. Stolen items rearranged, clothing shredded, photos taken. Each case had its own task force. Each built its own profile, and each came up empty. There were eerie similarities. The method of break-ins, the ability to disappear without a trace. The way victims were stalked, not just attacked, but with different jurisdictions, timelines, and no clear forensic overlap. No one connected them. These were treated as separate mysteries. That changed in 2001, when DNA testing revealed something shocking. The semen recovered from rape cases in the North matched DNA from murder scenes in the South. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were one and the same. The press coined a new name, the Golden State Killer. Still, there were no suspects. No usable fingerprints. No clear motive. Just a growing list of crimes. Rapes, murders, burglaries, linked by a single genetic fingerprint. As forensic science evolved, so did the investigation. But it would take another 17 years, a new kind of detective work, and an unconventional database to finally link that DNA to a name. In the 1980s, DNA evidence was still in its infancy. Blood types and hair samples could suggest a match, but not confirm one. The technology to read and compare genetic markers was expensive, time-consuming, and far from routine. Crime scenes preserved physical evidence, but much of it sat idle in storage, waiting for the science to catch up. That began to change in the early 1990s. Forensic labs started developing DNA profiles from old case files. In 1996, detectives in Contra Costa County submitted samples from several East Area Rapist cases. For years later, the breakthrough came. DNA from those rapes matched samples collected at murder scenes in Southern California, years and hundreds of miles apart. This proved that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. It was a turning point in the investigation, but also a frustrating one. The DNA matched itself, but not any known individual in the criminal databases. The man had never been arrested for a felony. He had never submitted his DNA. To the system, he was invisible. Investigators continued to collect samples from other unsolved cases, hoping for a new match. The profile of the Golden State Killer became one of the most searched in California's DNA database. Still, no hits. As technology improved, detectives tried new methods, familial DNA searches, mitochondrial DNA, even phenotyping predictions for hair and eye color. Nothing led them closer. Years passed. Leads dried up. The case grew cold once again. Then, In the late 2010s, a new frontier in DNA analysis emerged. Not in police labs, but in the world of amateur genealogy. And with it came the tool that would finally unmask a phantom. By 2018, DNA databases had grown beyond the criminal justice system. Millions of people had submitted their saliva to services like 23andMe and Ancestry to trace their roots. With their consent, these samples were stored and analyzed, building genetic profiles for ancestry reports. The raw data could be downloaded and uploaded elsewhere. GEDmatch was one such place. Unlike commercial services, GEDmatch was open source. It allowed users to upload DNA profiles from other services and compare them to others for free. It wasn't built for law enforcement, but it didn't ban it either. In a bold move, investigators working the Golden State Killer case created a profile from DNA recovered at crime scenes and uploaded it to GEDmatch. The profile didn't match anyone directly, but it matched a few distant relatives. Third cousins, great-great-grandparents shared generations ago. It was enough. Working with a genetic genealogist, the team began building family trees. They traced the connections backward, great-grandparents, then siblings, cousins, and descendants. They used public records, obituaries, birth certificates, marriage licenses. Layer by layer, the branches narrowed. One branch stood out. It led to a man named Joseph James D'Angelo. Born in 1945, a former police officer. He had lived in many of the areas where the crimes occurred. He was the right age, the right background, and had never submitted his DNA. To confirm the match, without tipping him off, law enforcement surveilled him. They collected a tissue he discarded in public and sent it to the lab. It matched the crime scene DNA. After over 40 years, the hunt was over. This was the first time a suspect in a major cold case had been identified using open-source genealogy. It wasn't a fingerprint or a confession. It was distant relatives, public trees, and one discarded sample. The method would spark debate over privacy. But in this case, it closed the door on one of the darkest chapters in California's history and opened the door to justice. On April 24, 2018, a quiet Sacramento suburb was swarming with unmarked cars. Neighbors watched as federal agents and local officers surrounded the modest single-story home of a 72-year-old man named Joseph James D'Angelo. He had lived there for decades, rode a motorcycle, complained about noise, worked in a local grocery warehouse after retiring from the police force. He was, to most, just another older man living out his retirement. But D'Angelo wasn't just another neighbor. He was the man behind over a dozen murders, more than 50 rapes, and at least 100 burglaries. He was the Golden State Killer. When officers arrested him outside his home, he reportedly looked surprised, but said little. Inside, investigators found a life that had gone undisturbed. A freezer stocked with food, tools arranged neatly, a home that betrayed no secrets. Yet in his past, there were clues. D'Angelo had served as a police officer in 2 California towns during the early years of the crime spree. He had been fired in 1979 for shoplifting, a hammer and dog repellent. After that, the East Area Rapist attacks in that region stopped. It was a chilling realization. While law enforcement searched desperately for a suspect, he had been one of them. He knew their procedures, their limitations. He knew how to disappear. The arrest sent shockwaves across the country. Survivors, many of whom had waited decades for justice, wept when they heard the news. The monster who had haunted their lives had a face, a name, and he was finally in custody. Joseph James D'Angelo was not the monster people imagined, at least not at first glance. Born in 1945 in Bath, New York, D'Angelo had a seemingly ordinary upbringing. He served in the Navy during the Vietnam War, then returned to California and earned a degree in criminal justice. In the early 1970s, he joined law enforcement, first in Exeter, then in Auburn. He worked traffic. He investigated burglaries. He wore the badge. But beneath the surface, something darker was building. In 1979, he was arrested for shoplifting from a hardware store, an incident that cost him his job on the force. The stolen items? a hammer and dog repellent. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor, then disappeared from public view. For the next several decades, D'Angelo lived a quiet life. He worked as a truck mechanic and later in a grocery distribution center. He married and had children. After his divorce, he remained in the same home, blending into suburban life. Neighbors described him as odd, irritable, prone to bursts of anger. He shouted at people over minor annoyances. He was intensely private, sometimes paranoid, but no one suspected he had a second life. He had stayed under the radar for over 40 years. There were no arrests, no convictions, nothing to tie him to the DNA left behind, until genealogical research pointed to his family tree. When his name emerged as a suspect, everything fit. The timelines, the geography, the training. He had lived near Visalia during the Ransacker crimes. He was a cop when the East Area Rapist began. He moved south around the time the murder started. Joseph D'Angelo had built two lives, one in daylight, one in darkness. And for decades, the mask had held, until it didn't. The legal process that followed Joseph D'Angelo's arrest was unlike any other in California's history. The scale of his crimes, the decades-long investigation, and the age of the defendant shaped every decision. In June 2020, D'Angelo, now frail and seated in a wheelchair, appeared in court. The pandemic-era hearing took place in a Sacramento State University ballroom, repurposed to allow social distancing. Survivors, families of victims, journalists, and law enforcement filled the space. D'Angelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping for purposes of robbery. He also admitted to dozens of other crimes, rapes, assaults, and burglaries, which were beyond the statute of limitations. The admissions were part of a plea agreement designed to avoid a lengthy trial and, more critically, the death penalty. For many victims, it was the first time they had ever seen the man who terrorized them. They gave impact statements, calm, composed, and unwavering. They described sleepless nights, shattered trust, broken families. Some forgave, others condemned, but all wanted to be heard. On August 21st, 2020, Joseph D'Angelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to California State Prison, Corcoran, where he remains to this day. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived, not through a dramatic courtroom revelation, but through quiet determination, evolving science, and the courage of survivors who never stopped demanding answers. The capture of the Golden State Killer marked more than the end of a criminal saga. It signaled a transformation in how cold cases are solved. Joseph D'Angelo's arrest was the first high-profile case cracked using forensic genetic genealogy. His identification proved that even decades-old crimes could be revisited with modern tools, and that criminals could be found not through their own DNA submissions, but through distant relatives who had uploaded their profiles voluntarily. The implications were immediate. Across the country, law enforcement agencies began applying the same method to unsolved crimes. In the months following D'Angelo's arrest, other cold cases, some dormant for over 30 years, were suddenly reopened. Suspects were identified. Arrests were made. Families who had long given up hope received phone calls they never expected. At the same time, the method stirred ethical and legal debates. GeneMatch and other databases quickly updated their policies, allowing users to opt in or out of law enforcement access. Privacy advocates raised concerns. Legislators began crafting new regulations. But for many, the results were undeniable. The Golden State Killer case had shown what could happen when science, persistence, and innovation came together. It demonstrated that no matter how carefully someone hid, the past could still speak. And that sometimes justice only waits for the right question and the right technology to catch up. The Golden State Killer evaded justice for over 4 decades. He stalked in silence, masked by fear, untraceable by the tools of his time. But in the end, he wasn't caught by chance or confession. He was caught by science, by the trail he didn't know he left. His arrest didn't erase the trauma or undo the lives shattered. But it did offer something once thought impossible: closure. For victims, for families, for the communities he terrorized. It also reshaped the future. Law enforcement now sees DNA not just as a tool, but as a key to unlocking history. Cold cases once thought unsolvable are being reopened, one by one. And while debates over privacy and technology continue, one fact remains clear. Every cell carries a truth, and sometimes that truth catches up. The Golden State Killer believed he would never be found. For years, he was right, until one thread, one match, unraveled the mask. So what do you think of today's video? Do you have something you want us to feature next? Tell us in the comments. It will also mean a lot to us if you like and subscribe. Close the book if you can. This is Black Chapter.